Chapter 4 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 1, Joan of Naples by Alexandre Dumas, translated by George Burnham Ives. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. 8 days after the funeral of the old queen, Bertrand of Artois came to Joan, distraught, dishevelled, in a state of agitation and confusion impossible to describe. Joan went quickly up to her lover, asking him with a look of fear to explain the cause of his distress. "I told you, madame," cried the young baron excitedly. "You will end by ruining us all, as you will never take any advice from me." "For God's sake, Bertrand, speak plainly. What has happened? What advice have I neglected?" "Madame, your noble husband, Andre of Hungary, has just been made king of Jerusalem and Sicily, and acknowledged by the court of Avignon, so henceforth you will be no better than his slave." "Count of Artois, you are dreaming." "No, madame, I am not dreaming. I have this fact to prove the truth of my words, that the Pope's ambassadors are arrived at Capua with the bull for his coronation, and if they do not enter Castel Nuovo this very evening, the delay is only to give the new king time to make his preparations." The queen bent her head as if a thunderbolt had fallen at her feet. "When I told you before," said the count with growing fury, "that we ought to use force to make a stand against him, that we ought to break the yoke of this infamous tyranny, and get rid of the man before he had the means of hurting you, you always drew back in childish fear, with a woman's cowardly hesitation." Joan turned a tearful look upon her lover. "God, my God!" she cried, clasping her hands in desperation. "Am I to hear this forever, this awful cry of death? You too, Bertrand, you too say the word, like Robert of Cabane, like Charles of Duras. Wretched man, why would you raise this bloody spectre between us, to check with icy hand our adulterous kisses? Enough of such crimes. If this wretched ambition makes him long to reign, let him be king. What matters his power to me if he leaves me with your love?" "It is not so sure that our love will last much longer." "What is this, Bertrand? You rejoice in this merciless torture?" "I tell you, madame, that the King of Naples has a black flag ready, and on the day of his coronation it will be carried before him." "And you believe," said Joan, pale as a corpse in its shroud, "you believe that this flag is a threat?" "Ay, and the threat begins to be put in execution." The queen staggered and leaned against the table to save herself from falling. "Tell me all," she cried in a choking voice. "Fear not to shock me. See, I am not trembling. Oh, Bertrand, I entreat you." "The traitors have begun with the man you most esteemed, the wisest counsellor of the crown, the best of magistrates, the noblest hearted, most rigidly virtuous—" "Andrea of Isernia?" "Madame, he is no more." Joan uttered a cry, as though the noble old man had been slain before her eyes. She respected him as a father. Then, sinking back, she remained profoundly silent. "How did they kill him?" she asked at last, fixing her great eyes in terror on the count. "Yesterday evening, as he left his castle, on the way to his own home, a man suddenly sprang out upon him before the Porta Petruccia. It was one of Andre's favourites, Conrad of Gotis, chosen no doubt because he had a grievance against the incorruptible magistrate on account of some sentence passed against him, and the murder would therefore be put down to motives of private revenge. The cowardly wretch gave a sign to 2 or 3 companions, who surrounded the victim and robbed him of all means of escape. The poor old man looked fixedly at his assassin and asked him what he wanted. 'I want you to lose your life at my hands, as I lost my case at yours,' cried the murderer, and leaving him no time to answer, he ran him through with his sword. Then the rest fell upon the poor man, who did not even try to call for help, and his body was riddled with wounds and horribly mutilated, and then left bathed in its blood." "Terrible," murmured the queen, covering her face. "It was only their first effort. The prescription lists are already full. Andre must needs have blood to celebrate his accession to the throne of Naples. And do you know, Joan, whose name stands first in the doomed list?" Whose? cried the queen, shuddering from head to foot. Mine, said the count calmly. Yours? cried Joan, drawing herself up to her full height. Are you to be killed next? Oh, be careful, Andre. You have pronounced your own death sentence. Long have I turned aside the dagger pointing to your breast, but you put an end to all my patience. Woe to you, Prince of Hungary! The blood which you have spilt shall fall on your own head. As she spoke, she had lost her pallor. Her lovely face was fired with revenge. Her eyes flashed lightning. This child of 16 was terrible to behold. She pressed her lover's hand with convulsive tenderness and clung to him as if she would screen him with her own body. Your anger is awakened too late, said he gently and sadly, for at this moment Joan seemed so lovely that he could reproach her with nothing. You do not know that his mother has left him a talisman preserving him from sword and poison. He will die, said Joan firmly. The smile that lighted up her face was so unnatural that the count was dismayed, and dropped his eyes. The next day the young Queen of Naples, lovelier, more smiling than ever, sitting carelessly in a graceful attitude beside a window which looked out on the magnificent view of the bay, was busy weaving a cord of silk and gold. The sun had run nearly 2/3 of his fiery course, and was gradually sinking his rays in the clear blue waters where Posilippo's head is reflected with its green and flowery crown. A warm, balmy breeze that had passed over the orange trees of Sorrento and Amalfi felt deliciously refreshing to the inhabitants of the capital, who had succumbed to torpor in the enervating softness of the day. The whole town was waking from a long siesta, breathing freely after a sleepy interval. The Molo was covered with a crowd of eager people dressed out in the brightest colours. The many cries of a festival, joyous songs, love ditties, sounded from all quarters of the vast amphitheatre, which is one of the chief marvels of creation. They came to the ears of Joan, and she listened as she bent over her work, absorbed in deep thought. Suddenly, when she seemed most busily occupied, the indefinable feeling of someone near at hand, and the touch of something on her shoulder made her start. She turned as though waked from a dream by contact with a serpent, and perceived her husband, magnificently dressed, carelessly leaning against the back of her chair. For a long time past the prince had not come to his wife in this familiar fashion, and to the queen the pretence of affection and careless behaviour augured ill. Andre did not appear to notice the look of hatred and terror that had escaped Joan in spite of herself, and assuming the best expression of gentleness as that his straight, hard features could contrive to put on in such circumstances as these, he smiled and asked, "Why are you making this pretty cord, dear dutiful wife?" "To hang you with, my lord," replied the queen with a smile. Andre shrugged his shoulders, seeing in the threat so incredibly rash nothing more than a pleasantry in rather bad taste. But when he saw that Joan resumed her work, he tried to renew the conversation. "I admit," he said in a perfectly calm voice, "that my question is quite unnecessary. From your eagerness to finish this handsome piece of work, I ought to suspect that it is destined for some fine knight of yours, whom you propose to send on a dangerous enterprise, wearing your colours. If so, my fair queen, I claim to receive my orders from your lips. Appoint the time and place for the trial, and I am sure beforehand of carrying off a prize that I shall dispute with all your adorers." "That is not so certain," said Joan, "if you are as valiant in war as in love." And she cast on her husband a look at once seductive and scornful, beneath which the young man blushed up to his eyes. "I hope," said Andre, repressing his feelings, "I hope soon to give you such proofs of my affection that you will never doubt it again." "And what makes you fancy that, my lord?" "I would tell you if you would listen seriously." "I am listening." "Well, it is a dream I had last night that gives me such confidence in the future." "A dream? You surely ought to explain that." "I dreamed that there was a grand fete in the town. An immense crowd filled the streets like an overflowing torrent, and the heavens were ringing with their shouts of joy. The gloomy granite facades were hidden by hangings of silk and festoons of flowers. The churches were decorated as though for some grand ceremony. I was riding side by side with you." Joan made a haughty movement. "Forgive me, madame, it was only a dream. I was on your right, riding a fine white horse, magnificently caparisoned. and the Chief Justice of the kingdom carried before me a flag unfolded in sign of honour. After riding in triumph through the main thoroughfares of the city, we arrived, to the sound of trumpets and clarions, at the royal church of Saint Clara, where your grandfather and my uncle are buried, and there, before the high altar, the Pope's ambassador laid your hand in mine and pronounced a long discourse, and then on our two heads in turn placed the crown of Jerusalem and Sicily, after which the nobles and the people shouted in one voice, "Long live the Queen and King of Naples!" And I, wishing to perpetuate the memory of so glorious a day, proceeded to create knights among the most zealous in our court.
And do you not remember the names of the chosen persons whom you judged worthy of your royal favours?
Assuredly, madame. Bertrand, Count of Artois.
Enough, my lord. I excuse you from naming the rest. I always supposed you were loyal and generous, but you give me fresh proof of it by showing favour to men whom I most honour and trust. I cannot tell if your wishes are likely soon to be realised, but in any case, feel sure of my perpetual gratitude.
Joan's voice did not betray the slightest emotion. Her look had become kind, and the sweetest smile was on her lip. But in her heart Andre's death was from that moment decided upon. The prince, too much preoccupied with his own projects of vengeance, and too confident in his all-powerful talisman and his personal valour, had no suspicion that his plans could be anticipated. He conversed a long time with his wife in a chatting, friendly way, trying to spy out her secret, and exposing his own by his interrupted phrases and mysterious reserves. When he fancied that every cloud of former resentment, even the lightest, had disappeared from Joan's brow, he begged her to go with her suite on a magnificent hunting expedition that he was organising for the 20th of August, adding that such a kindness on her part would be for him a sure pledge of their reconciliation and complete forgetfulness of the past. Joan promised with a charming grace, and the prince retired fully satisfied with the interview, carrying with him the conviction that he had only to threaten to strike a blow at the queen's favourite to ensure her obedience, perhaps even her love. But on the eve of the 20th of August, a strange and terrible scene was being enacted in the basement story of one of the lateral towers of Castel Nuovo. Charles of Durazzo, who had never ceased to brood secretly over his infernal plans, had been informed by the notary whom he had charged to spy upon the conspirators that on that particular evening they were about to hold a decisive meeting, and therefore, wrapped in a black cloak, he glided into the underground corridor and hid himself behind a pillar, there to await the issue of the conference. After 2 dreadful hours of suspense, every second marked out by the beating of his heart, Charles fancied he heard the sound of a door very carefully opened. The feeble ray of a lantern in the vault scarcely served to dispel the darkness, but a man coming away from the wall approached him, walking like a living statue. Charles gave a slight cough. The sign agreed upon. The man put out his light and hid away the dagger he had drawn in case of a surprise. "Is it you, Master Nicholas?" asked the duke in a low voice.
"It is I, my lord."
"What is it?"
"They have just fixed the prince's death for tomorrow, on his way to the hunt."
"Did you recognize every conspirator?"
"Every one, though their faces were masked when they gave their vote for death. I knew by their voices."
"Could you point out to me who they are?"
"Yes, this very minute. They are going to pass along the end of this corridor, and see, here is Tommaso Pace, walking in front of them to light their way."
Indeed, a tall spectral figure, black from head to foot, his face carefully hidden under a velvet mask, walked at the end of the corridor, lamp in hand, and stopped at the first step of a staircase which led to the upper floors. The conspirators advanced slowly, 2 by 2, like a procession of ghosts, appeared for one moment in the circle of light made by the torch, and again disappeared into the shadow.
"See, there are Charles and Bertrand of Artois," said the notary. "There are the Counts of Terlizzi and Catanzaro, the Grand Admiral and Grand Seneschal, Godfrey of Marsan, Count of Squillace, and Robert of Caban, Count of Eboli. The 2 women talking in a low voice, with eager gesticulations, are Catherine of Tarentum, Empress of Constantinople, and Philippa the Catanese. The queen's governess and chief lady, there is Donna Cancha, chamberwoman and confidant of Joan, and there is the Countess of Morcone."
The notary stopped on beholding a shadow alone, its head bowed, with arms hanging loosely, choking back her sobs beneath a hood of black. "Who is this woman who seems to drag herself so painfully along in their train?" asked the duke, pressing his companion's arm.
"That woman," said the notary, "is the queen."
"Ah, now I see," thought Charles, breathing freely with the same sort of satisfaction that Satan no doubt feels when a long-coveted soul falls at length into his power.
"And now, my lord," continued Master Nicholas, when all had returned once more into silence and darkness, "if you have bidden me to spy on these conspirators with a view to saving the young prince you are protecting with love and vigilance, you must hurry forward, for tomorrow maybe it will be too late."
"Follow me," cried the duke imperiously. "It is time you should know my real intention, and then carry out my orders with scrupulous exactness." With these words he drew him aside to a place opposite to where the conspirators had just disappeared. The notary mechanically followed through a labyrinth of dark corridors and secret staircases, quite at a loss how to account for the sudden change that had come over his master. Crossing one of the antechambers in the castle, they came upon Andre, who joyfully accosted them. Grasping the hand of his cousin Duras in his affectionate manner, he asked him in a pressing way that would brook no refusal, "Will you be of our hunting party tomorrow, Duke?" "Excuse me, my lord," said Charles, bowing down to the ground. "It would be impossible for me to go tomorrow, for my wife is very unwell, but I entreat you to accept the best falcon I have." And here he cast upon the notary a petrifying glance. The morning of the 20th of August was fine and calm, the irony of nature contrasting cruelly with the fate of mankind. From break of day, masters and valets, pages and knights, princes and courtiers, all were on foot. Cries of joy were heard on every side when the queen arrived on a snow-white horse at the head of the young and brilliant throng. Joan was perhaps paler than usual, but that might be because she had been obliged to rise very early. Andre, mounted on one of the most fiery of all the steeds he had tamed, galloped beside his wife, noble and proud, happy in his own powers, his youth, and the thousand gilded hopes that a brilliant future seemed to offer. Never had the court of Naples shown so brave an aspect. Every feeling of distrust and hatred seemed entirely forgotten. Friar Robert himself, suspicious as he was by nature, when he saw the joyous cavalcade go by under his window, looked out with pride, and stroking his beard, laughed at his own seriousness. Andre's intention was to spend several days hunting between Capua and Aversa, and only to return to Naples when all was in readiness for his coronation. Thus, the first day they hunted round about Melito, and went through 2 or 3 villages in the land of Labore. Towards evening the court stopped at Aversa, with a view to passing the night there, and since at that period there was no castle in the place worthy of entertaining the queen with her husband and numerous court, the convent of St. Peter's at Mahella was converted into a royal residence. This convent had been built by Charles II in the year of our Lord 1309. While the grand seneschal was giving orders for supper and the preparation of a room for Andre and his wife, the prince, who during the whole day had abandoned himself entirely to his favourite amusement, went up on the terrace to enjoy the evening air, accompanied by the good Isolda, his beloved nurse, who loved him more even than his mother, and would not leave his side for a moment. Never had the prince appeared so animated and happy. He was in ecstasies over the beauty of the country, the clear air, the scent of the trees around. He besieged his nurse with 1,000 queries, never waiting for an answer, and they were indeed long in coming, for poor Isolda was gazing upon him with that appearance of fascination which makes a mother absent-minded when her child is talking. Andre was eagerly telling her about a terrible boar he had chased that morning across the woods, how it had lain foaming at his feet, and Isolda interrupted him to say he had a grain of dust in his eye. Then Andre was full of his plans for the future, and Isolda stroked his fair hair, remarking that he must be feeling very tired. Then, heeding nothing but his own joy and excitement, the young prince hurled defiance at destiny, calling by all his gods on dangers to come forward, so that he might have the chance of quelling them, and the poor nurse exclaimed in a flood of tears, "My child, you love me no longer." Out of all patience with these constant interruptions, Andre scolded her kindly enough, and mocked at her childish fears. Then, paying no attention to a sort of melancholy that was coming over him, he bade her tell him old tales of his childhood, and had a long talk about his brother Louis, his absent mother, and tears were in his eyes when he recalled her last farewell. Isolda listened joyfully, and answered all he asked. But no fell presentiments shook her heart. The poor woman loved Andre with all the strength of her soul. For him she would have given up her life in this world and in the world to come. Yet she was not his mother. When all was ready, Robert of Cabane came to tell the prince that the queen awaited him. Andre cast one last look at the smiling fields beneath the starry heavens, pressed his nurse's hand to his lips and to his heart, and followed the grand seneschal slowly, and it seemed with some regret. But soon the brilliant lights of the room, the wine that circulated freely, the gay talk, the eager recitals of that day's exploits, served to disperse the cloud of gloom that had for a moment overspread the countenance of the prince. The queen alone, leaning on the table with fixed eyes and lips that never moved, sat at this strange feast, pale and cold as a baleful ghost summoned from the tomb to disturb the joy of the party. Andre, whose brain began to be affected by the draughts of wine from Capri and Syracuse, was annoyed at his wife's look, and, attributing it to contempt, filled a goblet to the brim and presented it to the queen. Joan visibly trembled, her lips moved convulsively, but the conspirators drowned in their noisy talk the involuntary groan that escaped her. In the midst of a general uproar, Robert of Cabane proposed that they should serve generous supplies of the same wine drunk at the royal table to the Hungarian guards who were keeping watch at the approaches to the convent, and this liberality evoked frenzied applause. The shouting of the soldiers soon gave witness to their gratitude for the unexpected gift, and mingled with the hilarious toasts of the banqueters. To put the finishing touch to Andre's excitement, there were cries on every side of "Long live the Queen! Long live His Majesty, the King of Naples!" The orgy lasted far into the night. The pleasures of the next day were discussed with enthusiasm, and Bertrand of Artois protested in a loud voice that if they were so late now, some would not rise early on the morrow. Andre declared that, for his part, an hour or two's rest would be enough to get over his fatigue, and he eagerly protested that it would be well for others to follow his example. The Count of Terlizzi seemed to express some doubt as to the prince's punctuality. Andre insisted, and challenging all the barons present to see who would be up first, he retired with the queen to the room that had been reserved for them, where he very soon fell into a deep and heavy sleep. About 2 o'clock in the morning, Tommaso Pace, the prince's valet and first usher of the royal apartments, knocked at his master's door to rouse him for the chase. At the first knock all was silence. At the second, Joan, who had not closed her eyes all night, moved as if to rouse her husband and warn him of the threatened danger. But at the third knock the unfortunate young man suddenly awoke, and hearing in the next room sounds of laughter and whispering, fancied that they were making a joke of his laziness, and jumped out of bed bareheaded, in nothing but his shirt, his shoes half on and half off. He opened the door, and at this point we translate literally the account of Domenico Gravina, a historian of much esteem. As soon as the prince appeared, the conspirators all at once fell upon him to strangle him with their hands, believing he could not die by poison or sword because of the charmed ring given him by his poor mother. But Andre was so strong and active that when he perceived the infamous treason he defended himself with more than human strength, and with dreadful cries got free from his murderers, his face all bloody, his fair hair pulled out in handfuls. The unhappy young man tried to gain his own bedroom so as to get some weapon and valiantly resist the assassins, but as he reached the door, Nicholas of Milazzo, putting his dagger like a bolt into the lock, stopped his entrance. The prince, calling aloud the whole time and imploring the protection of his friends, returned to the hall, but all the doors were shut, and no one held out a helping hand, for the queen was silent, showing no uneasiness about her husband's death. But the nurse, Isolda, terrified by the shouting of her beloved son and lord, leapt from her bed and went to the window, filling the house with dreadful cries. The traders, alarmed by the mighty uproar, although the place was lonely and so far from the centre of the town that nobody had come to see what the noise was, were on the point of letting their victim go, when Bertrand of Artois, who felt he was more guilty than the others, seized the prince with hellish fury round the waist, and after a desperate struggle got him down. Then dragging him by the hair of his head to a balcony which gave upon the garden, and pressing one knee upon his chest, cried out to the others, "Come here, barons! I have what we want to strangle him with." And round his neck he passed a long cord of silk and gold, while the wretched man struggled all he could. Bertrand quickly drew up the knot, and the others threw the body over the parapet of the balcony, leaving it hanging between earth and sky until death ensued. When the Count of Terlizzi averted his eyes from the horrid spectacle, Robert of Cabane cried out imperiously, "What are you doing there? The cord is long enough for us all to hold. We want not witnesses, we want accomplices." As soon as the last convulsive movements of the dying man had ceased, they let the corpse drop the whole height of 3 stories, and opening the doors of the hall, departed as though nothing had happened. Isolde, when at last she contrived to get a light, rapidly ran to the queen's chamber, and finding the door shut on the inside, began to call loudly on her Andre. There was no answer, though the queen was in the room. The poor nurse, distracted, trembling, desperate, ran down all the corridors, knocked at all the cells, and woke the monks one by one, begging them to help her look for the prince. The monks said that they had indeed heard a noise, but thinking it was a quarrel between soldiers, drunken perhaps or mutinous, they had not thought it their business to interfere. Isolde eagerly entreated. The alarm spread throughout the convent. The monks followed the nurse, who went on before with a torch. She entered the garden, saw something white upon the grass, advanced trembling, gave one piercing cry, and fell backward. The wretched Andre was lying in his blood, a cord round his neck as though he were a thief, his head crushed in by the height from which he fell. Then 2 monks went upstairs to the queen's room, and respectfully knocking at the door, asked in sepulchral tones, "Madame, what would you have us do with your husband's corpse?" And when the queen made no answer, they went down again slowly to the garden, and kneeling one at the head, the other at the foot of the dead man, they began to recite penitential psalms in a low voice. When they had spent an hour in prayer, 2 other monks went up in the same way to Joan's chamber, repeating the same question and getting no answer, whereupon they relieved the first 2 and began themselves to pray. Next, a 3rd couple went to the door of this inexorable room, and coming away perturbed by their want of success, perceived that there was a disturbance of people outside the convent, while vengeful cries were heard amongst the indignant crowd. The groups became more and more thronged, threatening voices were raised. A torrent of invaders threatened the royal dwelling, when the queen's guard appeared, lance in readiness, and a litter closely shut, surrounded by the principal barons of the court, passed through the crowd which stood stupidly gazing. Joan, wrapped in a black veil, went back to Castel Nuovo amid her escort, and nobody, say the historians, had the courage to say a word about this terrible deed. End of Chapter 4. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 5 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 1, Joan of Naples by Alexandre Dumas, translated by George Burnham Ives. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. The terrible part that Charles of Durazzo was to play began as soon as this crime was accomplished. The duke left the corpse 2 whole days exposed to the wind and the rain, unburied and dishonoured, the corpse of a man whom the Pope had made King of Sicily and Jerusalem, so that the indignation of the mob might be increased by the dreadful sight. On the 3rd he ordered it to be conveyed with the utmost pomp to the Cathedral of Naples, and assembling all the Hungarians around the catafalque, he thus addressed them in a voice of thunder: "Nobles and commoners, behold our king hanged like a dog by infamous traitors. God will soon make known to us the names of all the guilty. Let those who desire that justice may be done hold up their hands, and swear against murderers bloody persecution, implacable hatred, everlasting vengeance." It was this one man's cry that brought death and desolation to the murderers' hearts, and the people dispersed about the town, shrieking, "Vengeance! Vengeance!" Divine justice, which knows naught of privilege and respects no crown, struck Joan first of all in her love. When the 2 lovers first met, both were seized alike with terror and disgust. They recoiled trembling, and the queen, seeing in Bertrand her husband's executioner, and he in her the cause of his crime, possibly of his speedy punishment. Bertrand's looks were disordered, his cheeks hollow, his eyes encircled with black rings, his mouth horribly distorted, his arm and forefinger extended towards his accomplice. He seemed to behold a frightful vision rising before him. The same cord he had used when he strangled Andre he now saw round the queen's neck, so tight that it made its way into her flesh. An invisible force, a satanic impulse, urged him to strangle with his own hands the woman he had loved so dearly, had at one time adored on his knees. The count rushed out of the room with gestures of desperation. Muttering incoherent words as he showed plain signs of mental aberration, his father, Charles of Artois, took him away, and they went that same evening to their palace of St. Agatha, and there prepared a defence in case they should be attacked. But Joan's punishment, which was destined to be slow as well as dreadful, to last 37 years and end in a ghastly death, was now only beginning. All the wretched beings who were stained with Andre's death came in turn to her to demand the price of blood. The Catanese and her son, who held in their hands not only the queen's honour but her life, now became doubly greedy and exacting. Dona Concha no longer put any bridle on her licentiousness, and the Empress of Constantinople ordered her niece to marry her eldest son, Robert, Prince of Tarentum. Joan, consumed by remorse, full of indignation and shame at the arrogant conduct of her subjects, dared scarcely lift her head, and stooped to entreaties, only stipulating for a few days' delay before giving her answer. The Empress consented, on condition that her son should come to reside at Castelnuovo, with permission to see the queen once a day. Joan bowed her head in silence, and Robert of Tarentum was installed at the castle. Charles of Durazzo, who by the death of Andre had practically become the head of the family, and would by the terms of his grandfather's will inherit the kingdom by right of his wife Marie, in case of Joan's dying without lawful issue, sent to the queen two commands: first, that she should not dream of contracting a new marriage without first consulting him in the choice of a husband; secondly, that she should invest in him at once the title of Duke of Calabria. To compel his cousin to make these two concessions, he added that if she should be so ill-advised as to refuse either of them, he should hand over to justice the proofs of the crime and the names of the murderers. Joan, bending beneath the weight of this new difficulty, could think of no way to avoid it; but Catherine, who alone was stout enough to fight this nephew of hers, insisted that they must strike at the Duke of Durazzo in his ambition and hopes, and tell him to begin with, what was the fact, that the queen was pregnant. If, in spite of this news, he persisted in his plans, she would find some means or other, she said, of causing trouble and discord in her nephew's family, and wounding him in his most intimate affections or closest interests, by publicly dishonouring him through his wife or his mother. Charles smiled coldly when his aunt came to tell him from the queen that she was about to bring into the world an infant, Andre's posthumous child. What importance could a babe yet unborn possibly have? As a fact, it lived only a few months. In the eyes of a man who with such admirable coolness got rid of people who stood in his way, and that moreover by the hand of his own enemies, he told the Empress that the happy news she had condescended to bring him in person, far from diminishing his kindness towards his cousin, inspired him rather with more interest and goodwill; that consequently he reiterated his suggestion, and renewed his promise not to seek vengeance for his dear Andre, since in a certain sense the crime was not complete should a child be destined to survive. But in case of a refusal, he declared himself inexorable. He cleverly gave Catherine to understand that, as she had some interest herself in the prince's death, she ought for her own sake to persuade the queen to stop legal proceedings. The Empress seemed to be deeply impressed by her nephew's threatening attitude, and promised to do her best to persuade the queen to grant all he asked, on condition, however, that Charles should allow the necessary time for carrying through so delicate a business. But Catherine profited by this delay to think out her own plan of revenge, and ensure the means of certain success. After starting several projects eagerly and then regretfully abandoning them, she fixed upon an infernal and unheard of scheme, which the mind would refuse to believe but for the unanimous testimony of historians. Poor Agnes of Duras, Charles's mother, had for some few days been suffering with an inexplicable weariness, a slow, painful malady with which her son's restlessness and violence may have not a little to do. The Empress resolved that the first effect of her hatred was to fall upon this unhappy mother. She summoned the Count of Terlizzi and Dona Concha, his mistress, who by the queen's orders had been attending Agnes since her illness began. Catherine suggested to the young chamberwoman, who was at that time with child, that she should deceive the doctor by representing that certain signs of her own condition really belonged to the sick woman, so that he, deceived by the false indications, should be compelled to admit to Charles of Durazzo that his mother was guilty and dishonoured. The Count of Terlizzi, who ever since he had taken part in the regicide trembled in fear of discovery, had nothing to oppose to the Empress's desire, and Dona Concha, whose head was as light as her heart was corrupt, seized with a foolish gaiety on any chance of taking her revenge on the prudery of the only princess of the blood who led a pure life at a court that was renowned for its depravity. Once assured that her accomplices would be prudent and obedient, Catherine began to spread abroad certain vague and dubious but terribly serious rumours, only needing proof, and soon after the cruel accusation was started it was repeated again and again in confidence, until it reached the ears of Charles. At this amazing revelation the duke was seized with a fit of trembling. He sent instantly for the doctor, and asked imperiously what was the cause of his mother's malady. The doctor turned pale and stammered, but when Charles grew threatening, he admitted that he had certain grounds for suspecting that the duchess was insane. But, as he might easily have been deceived the first time, he would make a second investigation before pronouncing his opinion in so serious a matter. The next day, as the doctor came out of the bedroom, the duke met him, and interrogating him with an agonized gesture, could only judge by the silence that his fears were too well confirmed. But the doctor, with excess of caution, declared that he would make a third trial. Condemned criminals can suffer no worse than Charles in the long hours that passed before that fatal moment when he learned that his mother was indeed guilty. On the third day the doctor stated on his soul and conscience that Agnes of Durazzo was pregnant. "Very good," said Charles, dismissing the doctor with no sign of emotion. That evening the duchess took a medicine ordered by the doctor, and when, half an hour later, she was assailed with violent pains, the duke was warned that perhaps other physicians ought to be consulted, as the prescription of the ordinary doctor, instead of bringing about an improvement in her state, had only made her worse. Charles slowly went up to the duchess's room, and sending away all the people who were standing round her bed, on the pretext that they were clumsy and made his mother worse, he shut the door, and they were alone. Then poor Agnes, forgetting her internal agony when she saw her son, pressed his hand tenderly and smiled through her tears. Charles, pale beneath his bronzed complexion, his forehead moist with a cold sweat, and his eyes horribly dilated, bent over the sick woman and asked her gloomily— "Are you a little better, mother?"
"Ah, I am in pain, in frightful pain, my poor Charles. I feel as though I have molten lead in my veins. Oh, my son, call your brothers, so that I may give you all my blessing for the last time, for I cannot hold out long against this pain. I am burning. Mercy, call a doctor. I know I have been poisoned."
Charles did not stir from the bedside.
"Water!"
cried the dying woman in a broken voice.
"Water! A doctor! A confessor! My children! I want my children!"
And as the duke paid no heed, but stood moodily silent, the poor mother, prostrated by pain, fancied that grief had robbed her son of all power of speech or movement, and so by a desperate effort sat up and seized him by the arm, cried with all the strength she could muster—
"Charles, my son, what is it? My poor boy, courage! It is nothing, I hope. But quick, call for help, call a doctor. Ah, you have no idea of what I suffer."
"Your doctor," said Charles slowly and coldly, each word piercing his mother's heart like a dagger, "your doctor cannot come."
"Oh, why?"
asked Agnes, stupefied. "Because no one ought to live who knows the secret of our shame."
"Unhappy man!"
she cried, overwhelmed with pain and terror.
"You have murdered him. Perhaps you have poisoned your own mother too. Charles, have mercy on your own soul."
"It is your doing," said Charles, without show of emotion. "You have driven me into crime and despair. You have caused my dishonour in this world and my damnation in the next."
"What are you saying? My own Charles, have mercy! Do not let me die in this horrible uncertainty. What fatal delusion is binding you? Speak, my son, speak! I am not feeling the poison now. What have I done? Of what have I been accused?"
She looked with haggard eyes at her son. Her maternal love still struggled against the awful thought of matricide. At last, seeing that Charles remained speechless in spite of her entreaties, she repeated with a piercing cry—
"Speak, in God's name, before I die!"
"Mother, you are with child."
"What?"
cried Agnes with a loud cry which broke her very heart.
"Oh, God, forgive him! Charles, your mother forgives and blesses you in death."
Charles fell upon her neck, desperately crying for help. He would now have gladly saved her at the cost of his life, but it was too late. He uttered one cry that came from his heart, and was found stretched out upon his mother's corpse. Strange comments were made at the court on the death of the Duchess of Durazzo and her doctor's disappearance, but there was no doubt at all that grief and gloom were furrowing wrinkles on Charles's brow, which was already sad enough. Catherine alone knew the terrible cause of her nephew's depression, for to her it was very plain that the duke at one blow had killed his mother and her physician.
but she had never expected a reaction so sudden and violent in a man who shrank before no crime. She had thought Charles capable of everything except remorse. His gloomy, self-absorbed silence seemed a bad augury for her plans. She had desired to cause trouble for him in his own family, so that he might have no time to oppose the marriage of her son with the queen, but she had shot beyond her mark, and Charles, started thus on the terrible path of crime, had now broken through the bonds of his holiest affections, and gave himself up to his bad passions with feverish ardour and a savage desire for revenge. Then Catherine had recourse to gentleness and submission. She gave her son to understand that there was only one way of obtaining the queen's hand, and that was by flattering the ambition of Charles, and in some sort submitting himself to his patronage. Robert of Tarentum understood this, and ceased making court to Joan, who received his devotion with cool kindness, and attached himself closely to Charles, paying him much the same sort of respect and deference that he himself had affected for Andre, when the thought was first in his mind of causing his ruin. But the Duke of Durazzo was by no means deceived as to the devoted friendships shown towards him by the heir of the house of Tarentum, and pretending to be deeply touched by the unexpected change of feeling, he had all the time kept a strict guard on Robert's actions. An event outside all human foresight occurred to upset the calculations of the two cousins. One day, while they were out together on horseback, as they often were since their pretended reconciliation, Louis of Tarentum, Robert's youngest brother, who had always felt for Joan a chivalrous, innocent love, a love which a young man of 20 is apt to lock up in his heart as a secret treasure, Louis, we say, who had held aloof from the infamous family conspiracy, and had not soiled his hands with Andre's blood, drawn on by an irrepressible passion, all at once appeared at the gates of Castel Nuovo, and while his brother was wasting precious hours in asking for a promise of marriage, had the bridge raised, and gave the soldiers strict orders to admit no one. Then, never troubling himself about Charles's anger or Robert's jealousy, he hurried to the queen's room, and there, says Domenico Gravina, without any preamble, the union was consummated. On returning from his ride, Robert, astonished that the bridge was not at once lowered for him, at first loudly called upon the soldiers on guard at the fortress, threatening severe punishment for their unpardonable negligence. But as the gates did not open, and the soldiers made no sign of fear or regret, he fell into a violent fit of rage, and swore he would hang the wretches like dogs for hindering his return home. But the Empress of Constantinople, terrified at the bloody quarrel beginning between the two brothers, went alone and on foot to her son, and making use of her maternal authority to beg him to master his feelings, there in the presence of the crowd that had come up hastily to witness the strange scene, she related in a low voice all that had passed in his absence. A roar as of a wounded tiger escaped from Robert's breast. All but blind with rage, he nearly trampled his mother under the feet of his horse, which seemed to feel his master's anger, and, plunging violently, breathed blood from his nostrils. When the prince had poured every possible execration on his brother's head, he turned and galloped away from the accursed castle, flying to the Duke of Durazzo, whom he had only just left, to tell him of this outrage, and stir him to revenge. Charles was talking carelessly with his young wife, who was but little used to such tranquil conversation and expansiveness, when the Prince of Tarentum, exhausted, out of breath, bathed in perspiration, came up with his incredible tale. Charles made him say it twice over, so impossible did Louis's audacious enterprise appear to him. Then, quickly changing from doubt to fury, he struck his brow with his iron glove, saying that as the queen defied him, he would make her tremble even in her castle and in her lover's arms. He threw one withering look on Marie, who interceded tearfully for her sister, and pressing Robert's hand with warmth, vowed that so long as he lived Louis should never be Joan's husband. That same evening he shut himself up in his study and wrote letters whose effect soon appeared. A bull, dated June 2nd, 1346, was addressed to Bertram de Baux, Chief Justice of the Kingdom of Sicily and Count of Monte Scoglioso, with orders to make the most strict inquiries concerning Andre's murderers, whom the Pope likewise laid under his anathema, and to punish them with the utmost rigour of the law. But a secret note was appended to the bull, which was quite at variance with the designs of Charles. The sovereign pontiff expressly bade the Chief Justice not to implicate the queen in the proceedings, or the princes of the blood, so as to avoid worse disturbances, reserving, as supreme head of the church and lord of the kingdom, the right of judging them later on, as his wisdom might dictate. For this imposing trial Bertram de Baux made great preparations. A platform was erected in the great hall of tribunal, and all the officers of the crown and great state dignitaries, and all the chief barons had a place behind the enclosure where the magistrates sat. 3 days after Clement VI's bull had been published in the capital, the Chief Justice was ready for a public examination of 2 accused persons. The 2 culprits who had first fallen into the hands of justice were, as one may easily suppose, those whose condition was least exalted, whose lives were least valuable, Tommaso Pace and Nicholas of Milazzo. They were led before the tribunal to be first of all tortured, as was the custom. As they approached the judges, the notary, passing by Charles in the street, had time to say in a low voice, "My lord, the time has come to give my life for you. I will do my duty. I commend my wife and children to you." Encouraged by a nod from his patron, he walked on firmly and deliberately. The Chief Justice, after establishing the identity of the accused, gave them over to the executioner and his men to be tortured in the public square, so that their sufferings might serve as a show and an example to the crowd. But no sooner was Tommaso Pace tied to the rope, when, to the great disappointment of all, he declared that he would confess everything, and asked accordingly to be taken back before his judges. At these words, the Count of Terlizzi, who was following every movement of the 2 men with mortal anxiety, thought it was all over now with him and his accomplices, and so, when Tommaso Pace was turning his steps toward the great hall, led by 2 guards, his hands tied behind his back, and followed by the notary, he contrived to take him into a secluded house, and, squeezing his throat with great force, made him thus put his tongue out, whereupon he cut it off with a sharp razor. The yells of the poor wretch, so cruelly mutilated, fell on the ears of the Duke of Durazzo. He found his way into the room where the barbarous act had been committed just as the Count of Terlizzi was coming out, and approached the notary, who had been present at the dreadful spectacle, and had not given the least sign of fear or emotion. Master Nicholas, thinking the same fate was in store for him, turned calmly to the duke, saying with a sad smile, "My lord, the precaution is useless. There is no need for you to cut out my tongue, as the noble count has done to my poor companion. The last scrap of my flesh may be torn off without one word being dragged from my mouth. I have promised, my lord, and you have the life of my wife and the future of my children as guarantee for my word." "I do not ask for silence," said the duke solemnly. "You can free me from all my enemies at once, and I order you to denounce them at the tribunal." The notary bowed his head with mournful resignation, then raising it in affright, made one step up to the duke, and murmured, in a choking voice, "And the queen?" "No one would believe you if you ventured to denounce her. But when the Catanese and her son, the Count of Terlizzi and his wife, and her most intimate friends, have been accused by you, when they fail to endure the torture, and when they denounce her unanimously—" "I see, my lord, you do not only want my life, you would have my soul too. Very well, once more I commend to you my children." With a deep sigh, he walked up to the tribunal. The Chief Justice asked Tommaso Pace the usual questions, and a shudder of horror passed through the assembly when they saw the poor wretch, in desperation, opening his mouth, which streamed with blood. But surprise and terror reached their height when Nicholas of Milazzo slowly and firmly gave a list of Andre's murderers, all except the queen and the princes of the blood, and went on to give all details of the assassination. Proceedings were at once taken for the arrest of the Grand Seneschal, Robert of Cabane, and the Counts of Terlizzi and Marconi, who were present and had not ventured to make any movement in self-defence. An hour later, Philippa, her 2 daughters, and Donna Concha joined them in prison, after vainly imploring the queen's protection. Charles and Bertrand of Artois, shut up in their fortress of St. Agatha, bade defiance to justice, and several others, among them the Counts of Mileto and Catanzaro, escaped by flight. As soon as Master Nicholas said he had nothing further to confess, and that he had spoken the whole truth and nothing but the truth, the Chief Justice pronounced sentence amid a profound silence, and without delay Tommaso Pace and the notary were tied to the tails of 2 horses, dragged through the chief streets of the town, and hanged in the market-place. The other prisoners were thrown into a subterranean vault, to be questioned and put to the torture on the following day. In the evening, finding themselves in the same dungeon, they reproached one another, each pretending he had been dragged into the crime by someone else. Then Donna Concha, whose strange character knew no inconsistencies, even face to face with death and torture, drowned with a great burst of laughter the lamentations of her companions, and joyously exclaimed, "Look here, friends, why these bitter recriminations, this ill-mannered raving? We have no excuses to make, and we are all equally guilty.
I am the youngest of all, and not the ugliest, by your leave, ladies. But if I am condemned, at least I will die cheerfully, for I have never denied myself any pleasure I could get in this world, and I can boast that much will be forgiven me, for I have loved much. Of that you gentlemen know something. You bad old man," she continued to the Count of Terlizzi, "do you not remember lying by my side in the queen's antechamber? Come, no blushes before your noble family. Confess, my lord, that I am with child by your excellency, and you know how we managed to make up the story of poor Agnes of Durazzo and her pregnancy. God rest her soul! For my part, I never supposed the joke would take such a serious turn all at once. You know all this, and much more. Spare your lamentations, for, by my word, they are getting very tiresome. Let us prepare to die joyously, as we have lived."
With these words she yawned slightly, and lying down on the straw, fell into a deep sleep and dreamed as happy dreams as she ever had dreamed in her life. On the morrow, from break of day, there was an immense crowd on the sea-front. During the night an enormous palisade had been put up to keep the people away far enough for them to see the accused without hearing anything. Charles of Durazzo, at the head of a brilliant cortege of knights and pages, mounted on a magnificent horse, all in black, as a sign of mourning, waited near the enclosure. Ferocious joy shone in his eyes as the accused made their way through the crowd 2 by 2, their wrists tied with ropes, for the duke every minute expected to hear the queen's name spoken. But the chief justice, a man of experience, had prevented indiscretion of any kind by fixing a hook in the tongue of each one. The poor creatures were tortured on a ship, so that nobody should hear the terrible confessions their sufferings dragged from them. But Joan, in spite of the wrongs that most of the conspirators had done her, felt a renewal of pity for the woman she had once respected as a mother, for her childish companions and her friends, and possibly also some remains of love for Robert of Cabane, and sent 2 messengers to beg Bertram de Baux to show mercy to the culprits. But the chief justice seized these men and had them tortured, and on their confession that they were also implicated in Andre's murder, he condemned them to the same punishment as the others. Dona Concha alone, by reason of her situation, escaped the torture, and her sentence was deferred till the day of her confinement. As this beautiful girl was returning to prison with many a smile for all the handsomest cavalier she could see in the crowd, she gave a sign to Charles of Durazzo, as she neared him, to come forward, and since her tongue had not been pierced, for the same reason, with an iron instrument, she said some words to him awhile in a low voice. Charles turned fearfully pale, and putting his hand to his sword, cried, "Wretched woman!"
"You forget, my lord, I am under the protection of the law."
"My mother! Oh, my poor mother!" murmured Charles in a choked voice, and he fell backward. The next morning the people were beforehand with the executioner, loudly demanding their prey. All the national troops and mercenaries that the judicial authorities could command were echeloned in on the streets, opposing a sort of dam to the torrent of the raging crowd. The sudden insatiable cruelty that too often degrades human nature had awakened in the populace. All heads were turned with hatred and frenzy, all imaginations inflamed with the passion for revenge. Groups of men and women, roaring like wild beasts, threatened to knock down the walls of the prison if the condemned were not handed over to them to take the place of punishment. A great murmur arose, continuous, ever the same, like the growling of thunder. The queen's heart was petrified with terror. But, in spite of the desire of Bertram de Baux to satisfy the popular wish, the preparations for the solemn execution were not completed till midday, when the sun's rays fell scorchingly upon the town. There went up a mighty cry from 10,000 palpitating breasts when a report first ran through the crowd that the prisoners were about to appear. There was a moment of silence, and the prison doors rolled slowly back on their hinges with a rusty, grating noise. A triple row of horsemen, with lowered visor and lance in rest, started the procession, and amid yells and curses the condemned prisoners came out one by one, each tied upon a cart, gagged and naked to the waist, in charge of 2 executioners whose orders were to torture them the whole length of their way. On the first cart was the former laundress of Catana, afterwards wife of the Grand Seneschal and governess to the queen, Philippa of Cabane. The 2 executioners at right and left of her scourged her with such fury that the blood spurting up from the wounds left a long track in all the streets passed by the cortege. Immediately following their mother on separate carts came the Countesses of Terlizzi and Morcone, the elder no more than 18 years of age. The two sisters were so marvelously beautiful that in the crowd a murmur of surprise was heard, and greedy eyes were fixed upon their naked, trembling shoulders. But the men charged to torture them gazed with ferocious smiles upon their forms of seductive beauty, and armed with sharp knives cut off pieces of their flesh with a deliberate enjoyment, and threw them out to the crowd, who eagerly struggled to get them, signing to the executioners to show which part of the victims' bodies they preferred. Robert of Cabane, the Grand Seneschal, the Counts of Terlizzi and Marconi, Raymond Pace, brother of the old valet who had been executed the day before, and many more, were dragged on similar carts, and both scourged with ropes and slashed with knives. Their flesh was torn out with red-hot pincers, and flung upon brazen chafing dishes. No cry of pain was heard from the Grand Seneschal. He never stirred once in his frightful agony, yet the tortures put such fury into their work that the poor wretch was dead before the goal was reached. In the centre of the square of St. Eligius an immense stake was set up, and there the prisoners were taken, and what was left of their mutilated bodies was thrown into the flames. The Count of Terlizzi and the Grand Seneschal's widow were still alive, and 2 tears of blood ran down the cheeks of the miserable mother as she saw her son's corpse and the palpitating remains of her 2 daughters cast upon the fire. They by their stifled cries showed that they had not ceased to suffer. But suddenly a fearful noise overpowered the groans of the victims. The enclosure was broken and overturned by the mob. Like madmen they rushed at the burning pile, armed with sabres, axes, and knives, and snatching the bodies, dead or alive, from the flames, tore them to pieces, carrying off the bones to make whistles or handles for their daggers, as a souvenir of this horrible day. End of chapter 5. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 6 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 1, Joan of Naples by Alexandre Dumas, translated by George Burnham Ives. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The spectacle of this frightful punishment did not satisfy the revenge of Charles of Durazzo. Seconded by the Chief Justice, he daily brought about fresh executions, till Andre's death came to be no more than a pretext for the legal murder of all who opposed his projects. But Louis of Tarentum, who had won Joan's heart, and was eagerly trying to get the necessary dispensation for legalizing the marriage, from this time forward took as a personal insult every act of the High Court of Justice which was performed against his will and against the queen's prerogative. He armed all his adherents, increasing their number by all the adventurers he could get together, and so put on foot a strong enough force to support his own party and resist his cousin. Naples was thus split up into hostile camps, ready to come to blows on the smallest pretext, whose daily skirmishes, moreover, were always followed by some scene of pillage or death. But Louis had need of money both to pay his mercenaries and to hold his own against the Duke of Durazzo and his own brother Robert, and one day he discovered that the queen's coffers were empty. Joan was wretched and desperate, and her lover, though generous and brave, and anxious to reassure her so far as he could, did not very clearly see how to extricate himself from such a difficult situation. But his mother Catherine, whose ambition was satisfied in seeing one of her sons, no matter which, attain to the throne of Naples, came unexpectedly to their aid, promising solemnly that it would only take her a few days to be able to lay at her niece's feet a treasure richer than anything she had ever dreamed of, queen as she was. The empress then took half her son's troops, made for St. Agatha, and besieged the fortress where Charles and Bertrand of Artois had taken refuge when they fled from justice. The old count, astonished at the sight of this woman, who had been the very soul of the conspiracy, and not in the least understanding her arrival as an enemy, sent out to ask the intention of this display of military force, to which Catherine replied in words which we translate literally.
My friends, tell Charles, our faithful friend, that we desire to speak with him privately and alone concerning a matter equally interesting to us both, and he is not to be alarmed at our arriving in the guise of an enemy, for this we have done designedly, as we shall explain in the course of our interview. We know he is confined to bed by the gout, and therefore feel no surprise at his not coming out to meet us. Have the goodness to salute him on our part and reassure him, telling him that we desire to come in, if such is his good pleasure, with our intimate counsellor, Nicholas Acciajuoli, and 10 soldiers only, to speak with him concerning an important matter that cannot be entrusted to go-betweens.
Entirely reassured by these frank, friendly explanations, Charles of Artois sent out his son Bertrand to the empress to receive her with the respect due to her rank and high position at the court of Naples. Catherine went promptly to the castle with many signs of joy, and inquiring after the count's health and expressing her affection as soon as they were alone, she mysteriously lowered her voice and explained that the object of her visit was to consult a man of tried experience on the affairs of Naples, and to beg his active cooperation in the queen's favour. As, however, she was not pressed for time, she could wait at St. Agatha for the count's recovery to hear his views and tell him of the march of events since he left the court. She succeeded so well in gaining the old man's confidence and banishing his suspicions that he begged her to honour them with her presence as long as she was able, and little by little received all her men within the walls. This was what Catherine was waiting for. On the very day when her army was installed at St. Agatha, she suddenly entered the count's room, followed by 4 soldiers, and seizing the old man by the throat, exclaimed wrathfully,
"Miserable traitor! You will not escape from our hands before you have received the punishment you deserve. In the meanwhile, show me where your treasure is hidden, if you would not have me throw your body out to feed the crows that are swooping around these dungeons."
The count, half choking, the dagger at his breast, did not even attempt to call for help. He fell on his knees, begging the empress to save at least the life of his son, who was not yet well from the terrible attack of melancholia that had shaken his reason ever since the catastrophe. Then he painfully dragged himself to the place where he had hidden his treasure, and pointing with his finger, cried, "Take all! Take my life, but spare my son!" Catherine could not contain herself for joy when she saw spread out at her feet exquisite and incredibly valuable cups, caskets of pearls, diamonds, and rubies of marvellous value, coffers full of gold ingots, and all the wonders of Asia that surpassed the wildest imagination. But when the old man, trembling, begged for the liberty of his son as the price of his fortune and his own life, the empress resumed her cold, pitiless manner, and harshly replied,
"I have already given orders for your son to be brought here, but prepare for an eternal farewell, for he is to be taken to the fortress at Melfi, and you in all probability will end your days beneath the castle of St. Agatha."
The grief of the poor count at this violent separation was so great that a few days later he was found dead in his dungeon, his lips covered with a bloody froth, his hands gnawed in despair. Bertrand did not long survive him. He actually lost his reason when he heard of his father's death, and hanged himself on the prison grating. Thus did the murderers of Andre destroy one another like venomous animals shut up in the same cage. Catherine of Tarentum, carrying off the treasure she had so gained, arrived at the court of Naples, proud of her triumph and contemplating vast schemes. But new troubles had come about in her absence. Charles of Durazzo, for the last time desiring the queen to give him the duchy of Calabria, a title which had always belonged to the heir presumptive, and angered by her refusal, had written to Louis of Hungary, inviting him to take possession of the kingdom, and promising to help in the enterprise with all his own forces, and to give up the principal authors of his brother's death, who till now had escaped justice. The King of Hungary eagerly accepted these offers, and got ready an army to avenge Andre's death and proceed to the conquest of Naples. The tears of his mother Elizabeth and the advice of Friar Robert, the old minister who had fled to Buda, confirmed him in his projects of vengeance. He had already lodged a bitter complaint at the court of Avignon that, while the inferior assassins had been punished, she who was above all others guilty had been shamefully let off scot-free, and though still stained with her husband's blood, continued to live a life of debauchery and adultery. The Pope replied soothingly that, so far as it depended upon him, he would not be found slow to give satisfaction to a lawful grievance, but the accusation ought to be properly formulated and supported by proof. That no doubt Joan's conduct during and after her husband's death was blamable, but His Majesty must consider that the Church of Rome, which before all things seeks truth and justice, always proceeds with the utmost circumspection, and in so grave a matter more especially must not judge by appearances only. Joan, frightened by the preparations for war, sent ambassadors to the Florentine Republic to assert her innocence of the crime imputed to her by public opinion, and did not hesitate to send excuses even to the Hungarian court. But Andre's brother replied in a letter, laconic and threatening: "Your former disorderly life, the arrogation to yourself of exclusive power, your neglect to punish your husband's murderers, your marriage to another husband, moreover, your own excuses are all sufficient proofs that you were an accomplice in the murder." Catherine would not be put out of heart by the King of Hungary's threats, and looking at the position of the queen and her son with a coolness that was never deceived, she was convinced that there was no other means of safety except a reconciliation with Charles, their mortal foe, which could only be brought about by giving him all he wanted. It was one of two things: either he would help them to repulse the King of Hungary, and later on they would pay the cost when the dangers were less pressing, or he would be beaten himself, and thus they would at least have the pleasure of drawing him down with them in their own destruction. The agreement was made in the gardens of Castel Nuovo, whither Charles had repaired on the invitation of the queen and her aunt. To her cousin of Durazzo, Joan accorded the title so much desired of Duke of Calabria, and Charles, feeling that he was hereby made heir to the kingdom, marched at once on Aquila, which town already was flying the Hungarian colours. The wretched man did not foresee that he was going straight to his destruction. When the Empress of Constantinople saw this man, whom she hated above all others, depart in joy, she looked contemptuously upon him, divining by a woman's instinct that mischief would befall him. Then, having no further mischief to do, no further treachery on earth, no further revenge to satisfy, she all at once succumbed to some unknown malady and died suddenly, without uttering a cry or exciting a single regret. But the King of Hungary, who had crossed Italy with a formidable army, now entered the kingdom from the side of Aquila. On his way he had everywhere received marks of interest and sympathy, and Alberto and Martino del Scala, lords of Verona, had given him 300 horse to prove that all their goodwill was with him in his enterprise. The news of the arrival of the Hungarians threw the court into a state of confusion impossible to describe. They had hoped that the king would be stopped by the Pope's legate, who had come to Foligno to forbid him, in the name of the Holy Father, and on pain of excommunication, to proceed any farther without his consent. But Louis of Hungary replied to the Pope's legate that, once master of Naples, he should consider himself a feudatory of the Church, but till then he had no obligations except to God and his own conscience. Thus the avenging army fell like a thunderbolt upon the heart of the kingdom, before there was any thought of taking serious measures for defence. There was only one plan possible. The queen assembled the barons who were most strongly attached to her, made them swear homage and fidelity to Louis of Tarentum, whom she presented to them as her husband, and then, leaving with many tears her most faithful subjects, she embarked secretly in the middle of the night on a ship of Provence and made for Marseille. Louis of Tarentum, following the prompting of his adventure-loving character, left Naples at the head of 3,000 horse and a considerable number of foot, and took up his post on the banks of the Volturno, there to contest the enemy's passage. But the King of Hungary foresaw the stratagem, and while his adversary was waiting for him at Capua, he arrived at Beneventum, by the mountains of Alife and Marcone, and on the same day received Neapolitan envoys. They, in a magnificent display of eloquence, congratulated him on his entrance, offered the keys of the town, and swore obedience to him as being the legitimate successor of Charles of Anjou. The news of the surrender of Naples soon reached the queen's camp, and all the princes of the blood and the generals left Louis of Tarentum and took refuge in the capital. Resistance was impossible. Louis, accompanied by his councillor, Nicholas Acciajuoli, went to Naples on the same evening on which his relatives quitted the town to get away from the enemy. Every hope of safety was vanishing as the hours passed by. His brothers and cousins begged him to go at once, so as not to draw down upon the town the king's vengeance. But unluckily there was no ship in the harbour that was ready to set sail. The terror of the princes was at its height. But Louis, trusting in his luck, started with the brave Acciajuoli in an unseaworthy boat, and ordering 4 sailors to row with all their might, in a few minutes disappeared, leaving his family in a great state of anxiety till they learned that he had reached Pisa, whither he had gone to join the queen in Provence. Charles of Durazzo and Robert of Tarentum, who were the eldest respectively of the 2 branches of the royal family, after hastily consulting, decided to soften the Hungarian monarch's wrath by a complete submission. Leaving their young brothers at Naples, they accordingly set off for Aversa, where the king was. Louis received them with every mark of friendship, and asked with much interest why their brothers were not with them. The princes replied that their young brothers had stayed at Naples to prepare a worthy reception for his majesty. Louis thanked them for their kind intentions, but begged them to invite the young princes now, saying that it would be infinitely more pleasant to enter Naples with all his family, and that he was most anxious to see his cousins. Charles and Robert, to please the king, sent equerries to bid their brothers come to Aversa, but Louis of Durazzo, the eldest of the boys, with many tears begged the others not to obey, and sent a message that he was prevented by a violent headache from leaving Naples. So puerile an excuse could not fail to annoy Charles, and the same day he compelled the unfortunate boys to appear before the king, sending a formal order which admitted of no delay. Louis of Hungary embraced them warmly one after the other, asked them several questions in an affectionate way, kept them to supper, and only let them go quite late at night. When the Duke of Durazzo reached his room, Lello of Aquila and the Count of Fondi slipped mysteriously to the side of his bed, and making sure that no one could hear, told him that the king in a council held that morning had decided to kill him and imprison the other princes. Charles heard them out, but incredulously. Suspecting treachery, he dryly replied that he had too much confidence in his cousin's loyalty to believe such a black calumny. Lello insisted, begging him in the name of his dearest friends to listen, but the duke was impatient and harshly ordered him to depart. The next day there was the same kindness on the king's part, the same affection shown to the children, the same invitation to supper. The banquet was magnificent. The room was brilliantly lighted, and the reflections were dazzling. Vessels of gold shone on the table, the intoxicating perfume of flowers filled the air, wine foamed in the goblets and flowed from the flagons in ruby streams. Conversation, excited and discursive, was heard on every side. All faces beamed with joy. Charles of Durazzo sat opposite the king at a separate table among his brothers. Little by little his look grew fixed, his brow pensive. He was fancying that Andre might have supped in this very hall on the eve of his tragic end, and he thought how all concerned in that death had either died in torment or were now languishing in prison. The queen, in exile and a fugitive, was begging pity from strangers. He alone was free. The thought made him tremble, but admiring his own cleverness in pursuing his infernal schemes, and putting away his sad looks, he smiled again with an expression of indefinable pride. The madman at this moment was scoffing at the justice of God, but Lello of Aquila, who was waiting at the table, bent down, whispering gloomily, "Unhappy duke, why did you refuse to believe me? Fly, while there is still yet time." Charles, angered by the man's obstinacy, threatened that if he were such a fool as to say any more, he would repeat every word aloud. "I have done my duty," murmured Lello, bowing his head. "Now it must happen as God wills." As he left off speaking, the king rose, and as the duke went up to take his leave, his face suddenly changed, and he cried in an awful voice, "Traitor! At length you are in my hands, and you shall die as you deserve. But before you are handed over to the executioner, confess with your own lips your deeds of treachery towards our royal majesty. So shall we need no other witnesses to condemn you to a punishment proportioned to your crimes. Between our two selves, Duke of Durazzo, tell me first why, by your infamous manoeuvring, you aided your uncle, the Cardinal of Perigord, to hinder the coronation of my brother, and so led him on, since he had no royal prerogative of his own, to his miserable end. Oh, make no attempt to deny it. Here is the letter, sealed with your seal. In secret you wrote it, but it accuses you in public. Then why, after bringing us hither to avenge our brother's death, of which you beyond all doubt were the cause, why did you suddenly turn to the queen's party and march against our town of Aquila, daring to raise an army against our faithful subjects? You hoped, traitor, to make use of us as a footstool to mount the throne withal, as soon as you were free from every other rival. Then you would have awaited our departure to kill the viceroy we should have left in our place, and so seize the kingdom. But this time your foresight has been at fault. There is yet another crime worse than all the rest, a crime of high treason, which I shall remorselessly punish. You carried off the bride that our ancestor, King Robert, designed for me, as you knew by his will. Answer, wretch, what excuse can you make for the rape of the Princess Marie?" Anger had so changed Louis's voice that the last words sounded like the roar of a wild beast. His eyes glittered with a feverish light, his lips were pale and trembling. Charles and his brothers fell upon their knees, frozen by mortal terror, and the unhappy duke twice tried to speak, but his teeth were chattering so violently that he could not articulate a single word. At last, casting his eyes about him and seeing his poor brothers innocent and ruined by his fault, he regained some sort of courage and said, "My lord, you look upon me with a terrible countenance that makes me tremble. But on my knees I entreat you, have mercy on me if I have done wrong, for God is my witness that I did not call you to this kingdom with any criminal intention. I have always desired, and still desire, your supremacy in all the sincerity of my soul. Some treacherous counsellors, I am certain, have contrived to draw down your hatred upon me. If it is true, as you say, that I went with an armed force to Aquila, I was compelled by Queen Joan, and I could not do otherwise. But as soon as I heard of your arrival at Fermo, I took my troops away again. I hope, for the love of Christ, I may obtain your mercy and pardon, by reason of my former services and constant loyalty. But as you see, you are now angry with me. I say no more, waiting for your fury to pass over. Once again, my lord, have pity on us, since we are in the hands of your majesty." The king turned away his head and retired slowly, confiding the prisoners to the care of Stephen Voivoda and the Count of Zornik, who guarded them during the night in a room adjoining the king's chamber. The next day, Louis held another meeting of his council and ordered that Charles should have his throat cut on the very spot where poor Andre had been hanged. He then sent the other princes of the blood, loaded with chains, to Hungary, where they were long kept prisoners. Charles, quite thunderstruck by such an unexpected blow, overwhelmed by the thought of his past crimes, trembled like a coward face to face with death, and seemed completely crushed. Bowed upon his knees, his face half hidden in his hands, from time to time convulsive sobs escaped him, as he tried to fix the thoughts that chased each other through his mind like the shapes of a monstrous dream. Night was in his soul, but every now and then light flashed across the darkness, and over the gloomy background of his despair passed gilded figures fleeing from him with smiles of mockery. In his ears buzzed voices from the other world. He saw a long procession of ghosts like the conspirators whom Nicholas of Milazzo had pointed out in the vaults of Castel Nuovo. But these phantoms each held his head in his hand, and shaking it by the hair bespattered him with drops of blood. Some brandished whips, some knives. Each threatened Charles with his instrument of torture. Pursued by the nocturnal train, the hapless man opened his mouth for one mighty cry, but his breath was gone, and it died upon his lips. Then he beheld his mother stretching out her arms from afar, and he fancied that if he could but reach her he would be safe. But at each step the path grew more and more narrow. Pieces of his flesh were torn off by the approaching walls. At last, breathless, naked, and bleeding, he reached his goal, but his mother glided farther away, and it was all to begin over again. The phantoms pursued him, grinning and screaming in his ears. "Cursed be he who slayeth his mother!" Charles was roused from these horrors by the cries of his brothers, who had come to embrace him for the last time before embarking. The duke in a low voice asked their pardon, and then fell back into his state of despair. The children were dragged away, begging to be allowed to share their brother's fate, and crying for death as an alleviation of their woes. At length they were separated, but the sound of their lamentations sounded long in the heart of the condemned man. After a few moments, 2 soldiers and 2 equerries came to tell the duke that his hour had come. Charles followed them, unresisting, to the fatal balcony where Andre had been hanged. He was there asked if he desired to confess, and when he said yes, they brought a monk from the same convent where the terrible scene had been enacted. He listened to the confession of all his sins, and granted him absolution. The duke at once rose and walked to the place where Andre had been thrown down for the cord to be put around his neck, and there, kneeling again, he asked his executioners, "Friends, in pity tell me, is there any hope for my life?" And when they answered no, Charles exclaimed, "Then carry out your instructions." At these words, one of the equerries plunged his sword into his breast, and the other cut his head off with a knife, and his corpse was thrown over the balcony into the garden, where Andre's body had lain for 3 days unburied. End of chapter 6. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 7 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 1. Joan of Naples by Alexandre Dumas, translated by George Burnham Ives. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The King of Hungary, his black flag ever borne before him, started for Naples, refusing all offered honours and rejecting the canopy beneath which he was to make his entry, not even stopping to give audience to the chief citizens or to receive the acclamations of the crowd. Armed at all points, he made for Castel Nuovo, leaving behind him dismay and fear. His first act on entering the city was to order Dona Cancha to be burnt, her punishment having been deferred by reason of her pregnancy. Like the others, she was drawn on a cart to the square of St. Eligius, there consigned to the flames. The young creature, whose suffering had not impaired her beauty, was dressed as for a festival, and laughing like a mad thing up to the last moment, mocked at her executioners and threw kisses to the crowd. A few days later, Godfrey of Marsana, Count of Squillace and Grand Admiral of the kingdom, was arrested by the king's orders. His life was promised him on condition of delivering up Conrad of Catanzaro, one of his relatives accused of conspiring against Andre. The Grand Admiral committed this act of shameless treachery, and did not shrink from sending his own son to persuade Conrad to come to the town. The poor wretch was given over to the king and tortured alive on a wheel made with sharp knives. The sight of these barbarities, far from calming the king's rage, seemed to inflame it the more. Every day there were new accusations and new sentences. The prisons were crowded. Louis's punishments were redoubled in severity. A fear arose that the town, and indeed the whole kingdom, were to be treated as having taken part in Andre's death. Murmurs arose against this barbarous rule, and all men's thoughts turned toward their fugitive queen. The Neapolitan barons had taken the oath of fidelity with no willing hearts, and when it came to the turn of the counts of San Severino, they feared a trick of some kind and refused to appear altogether before the Hungarian, but took refuge in the town of Salerno, and sent Archbishop Roger, their brother, to make sure of the king's intentions beforehand. Louis received him magnificently, and appointed him privy councillor and grand protonotary. Then, and not till then, did Robert of San Severino and Roger, Count of Chiaramonte, venture into the king's presence. After doing homage, they retired to their homes. The other barons followed their example of caution, and hiding their discontent under a show of respect, awaited a favourable moment for shaking off the foreign yoke. But the queen had encountered no obstacle in her flight, and arrived at Nice 5 days later. Her passage through Provence was like a triumph. Her beauty, youth, and misfortunes, even certain mysterious reports as to her adventures, all contributed to arouse the interest of the Provençal people. Games and fetes were improvised to soften the hardship of exile for the proscribed princess. But amid the outbursts of joy from every town, castle, and city, Joan, always sad, lived ever in her silent grief and glowing memories. At the gates of Aix she found the clergy, the nobility, and the chief magistrates, who received her respectfully but with no signs of enthusiasm. As the queen advanced, her astonishment increased as she saw the coldness of the people, and the solemn, constrained air of the great men who escorted her. Many anxious thoughts alarmed her, and she even went so far as to fear some intrigue of the King of Hungary. Scarcely had her cortege arrived at Castle Arnaud, when the nobles, dividing into 2 ranks, let the queen pass with her councillor Spinelli and 2 women. Then, closing up, they cut her off from the rest of her suite. After this, each in turn took up his station as guardian of the fortress. There was no room for doubt. The queen was a prisoner, but the cause of the manoeuvre it was impossible to guess. She asked the high dignitaries, and they, protesting respectful devotion, refused to explain till they had news from Avignon. Meanwhile, all honours that a queen could receive were lavished on Joan, but she was kept in sight and forbidden to go out. This new trouble increased her depression. She did not know what had happened to Louis of Tarentum, and her imagination, always apt at creating disasters, instantly suggested that she would soon be weeping for his loss. But Louis, always with his faithful Acciajuoli, had after many fatiguing adventures been shipwrecked at the port of Pisa. Thence he had taken route for Florence to beg men and money, but the Florentines decided to keep an absolute neutrality, and refused to receive him. The prince, losing his last hope, was pondering gloomy plans, when Nicholas Acciajuoli thus resolutely addressed him: "My lord, it is not given to mankind to enjoy prosperity for ever. There are misfortunes beyond all human foresight. You were once rich and powerful, and you are now a fugitive in disguise, begging the help of others. You must reserve your strength for better days. I still have a considerable fortune, and also have relations and friends whose wealth is at my disposal. Let us try to make our way to the queen, and at once decide what we can do. I myself shall always defend you and obey you as my lord and master." The prince received these generous offers with the utmost gratitude, and told his councillor that he placed his person in his hands, and all that remained of his future. Acciajuoli, not content with serving his master as a devoted servant, persuaded his brother Angelo, Archbishop of Florence, who was in great favour of Clement VI's court, to join with them in persuading the pope to interest himself in the cause of Louis of Tarentum. So, without further delay, the prince, his councillor, and the good prelate made their way to the port of Marseille. But learning that the queen was a prisoner at Aix, they embarked at Acquemort. then went straight to Avignon. It soon appeared that the Pope had a real affection and esteem for the character of the Archbishop of Florence, for Louis was received with paternal kindness at the court of Avignon, which was far more than he had expected. When he kneeled before the sovereign pontiff, His Holiness bent affectionately towards him and helped him to rise, saluting him by the title of king. 2 days later, another prelate, the Archbishop of Eye, came into the queen's presence. "Most gracious and dearly beloved sovereign, permit the most humble and devoted of your servants to ask pardon, in the name of your subjects, for the painful but necessary measure they have thought fit to take concerning your majesty. When you arrived on our coast, your loyal town of Eye had learned from a trustworthy source that the King of France was proposing to give our country to one of his own sons, making good this loss to you by the cessation of another domain. Also, that the Duke of Normandy had come to Avignon to request this exchange in person. We were quite decided, madame, and had made a vow to God that we would give up everything rather than suffer the hateful tyranny of the French. But before spilling blood, we thought it best to secure your august person as a sacred hostage, a sacred ark, which no man dared touch but was smitten to the ground, which indeed must keep away from our walls the scourge of war. We have now read the former annulment of this hateful plan in a brief sent by the sovereign pontiff from Avignon, and in this brief he himself guarantees your good faith. We give you your full and entire liberty, and henceforth we shall only endeavour to keep you among us by prayers and protestations. Go then, madame, if that is your pleasure, but before you leave these lands, which will be plunged into mourning by your withdrawal, leave us with some hope that you forgive the apparent violence to which we have subjected you, only in fear that we might lose you, and remember that on the day when you cease to be our queen, you signed the death warrant of all your subjects." Joan reassured the archbishop and the deputation from her good town of Eye with a melancholy smile, and promised that she would always cherish the memory of their affection. From this time she could not be deceived as to the real sentiments of the nobles and people, and a fidelity so uncommon, revealed with sincere tears, touched her heart and made her reflect bitterly upon her past. But a league's distance from Avignon, a magnificent triumphal reception awaited her. Louis of Tarentum and all the cardinals present at the court had come out to meet her. Pages in dazzling dress carried above Joan's head a canopy of scarlet velvet, ornamented with fleurs-de-lis and gold and plumes. Handsome youths and lovely girls, their heads crowned with flowers, went before her singing her praise. The streets were bordered with a living hedge of people, the houses were decked out, the bells rang a triple peal, as at the great church festivals. Clement VI first received the queen at the castle of Avignon with all the pomp he knew so well how to employ on solemn occasions. Then she was lodged in the palace of Cardinal Napoleon of Orsini, who, on his return from the conclave at Perugia, had built this regal dwelling at Villeneuve, inhabited later by the popes. No words could give an idea of the strangely disturbed condition of Avignon at this period. Since Clement V had transported the seat of the papacy to Provence, there had sprung up, in this rival to Rome, squares, churches, cardinals' palaces of unparalleled splendour. All the business of nations and kings was transacted at the castle of Avignon. Ambassadors from every court, merchants of every nation, adventurers of all kinds, Italians, Spaniards, Hungarians, Arabs, Jews, soldiers, Bohemians, jesters, poets, monks, courtesans, swarmed and clustered here, and hustled one another in the streets. There was confusion of tongues, customs, and costumes, an inextricable mixture of splendour and rags, riches and misery, debasement and grandeur. The austere poets of the Middle Ages stigmatized the accursed city in their writings under the name of the New Babylon. There is one curious monument of Joan's sojourn at Avignon and the exercise of her authority as sovereign. She was indignant at the effrontery of the women of the town, who elbowed everybody shamelessly in the streets, and published a notable edict, the first of its kind, which has since served as a model in like cases, to compel all unfortunate women who trafficked in their honour to live shut up together in a house that was bound to be open every day in the year except the last 3 days of Holy Week, the entrance to be barred to Jews at all times. An abbess, chosen once a year, had the supreme control over this strange convent. Rules were established for the maintenance of order, and severe penalties inflicted for any infringement of discipline. The lawyers of the period gained a great reputation by this salutary institution. The fair ladies of Avignon were eager in their defence of the queen in spite of the calumnious reports that strove to tarnish her reputation. With one voice, the wisdom of Andre's widow was extolled. The concert of praises was disturbed, however, by murmurs from the recluses themselves, who in their own brutal language declared that Joan of Naples was impeding their commerce so as to get a monopoly for herself. Meanwhile, Marie of Durazzo had joined her sister. After her husband's death, she had found means to take refuge in the convent of Santa Croce with her 2 little daughters, and while Louis of Hungary was busy burning his victims, the unhappy Marie had contrived to make her escape in the frock of an old monk, and as by a miracle to get on board a ship that was setting sail for Provence. She related to her sister the frightful details of the king's cruelty, and soon a new proof of his implacable hatred confirmed the tales of the poor princess. Louis's ambassadors appeared at the court of Avignon to demand formally the queen's condemnation. It was a great day when Joan of Naples pleaded her own cause before the pope, in the presence of all the cardinals then at Avignon, all the ambassadors of foreign powers, and all the eminent persons come from every quarter of Europe to be present at this trial, unique in the annals of history. We must imagine a vast enclosure in whose midst, upon a raised throne, as president of the august tribunal, sat God's vicar on earth, absolute and supreme judge, emblem of temporal and spiritual power, of authority human and divine. To the right and left of the sovereign pontiff, the cardinals in their red robes sat in chairs set round in a circle, and behind these princes of the Sacred College stretched rows of bishops extending to the end of the hall, with vicars, canons, deacons, archdeacons, and the whole immense hierarchy of the Church. Facing the pontifical throne was a platform reserved for the Queen of Naples and her suite. At the Pope's feet stood the ambassadors from the King of Hungary, who played the part of accusers without speaking a word, the circumstances of the crime and all the proofs having been discussed beforehand by a committee appointed for the purpose. The rest of the hall was filled by a brilliant crowd of high dignitaries, illustrious captains, and noble envoys, all vying with one another in proud display. Everyone ceased to breathe, all eyes were fixed on the dais where Joan was to speak her own defence. A movement of uneasy curiosity made this compact mass of humanity surge towards the centre. The cardinals above raised like proud peacocks over a golden harvest field shaken in the breeze. The queen appeared, hand in hand with her uncle, the old cardinal of Perigord, and her aunt, the Countess Agnes. Her gait was so modest and proud, her countenance so melancholy and pure, her look so open and confident, that even before she spoke every heart was hers. Joan was now 20 years of age. Her magnificent beauty was fully developed, but an extreme pallor concealed the brilliance of her transparent satin skin, and her hollow cheek told the tale of expiation and suffering. Among the spectators who looked on most eagerly there was a certain young man with strongly marked features, glowing eyes, and brown hair, whom we shall meet again later on in our narrative, but we will not divert our readers' attention, but only tell them that his name was James of Aragon, that he was Prince of Majorca, and would have been ready to shed every drop of his blood only to check one single tear that hung on Joan's eyelids. The queen spoke in an agitated, trembling voice, stopping from time to dry her moist and shining eyes, or to breathe one of those deep sighs that go straight to the heart. She told the tale of her husband's death painfully and vividly, painted truthfully the mad terror that had seized upon her and struck her down at that frightful time, raised her hands to her brow with the gesture of despair, as though she would wrest the madness from her brain, and a shudder of pity and awe passed through the assembled crowd. It is a fact that at this moment, if her words were false, her anguish was both sincere and terrible. An angel soiled by crime, she lied like Satan himself, but like him too she suffered all the agony of remorse and pride. Thus, when at the end of her speech she burst into tears and implored help and protection against the usurper of her kingdom, a cry of general assent drowned her closing words. Several hands flew to their sword hilts, and the Hungarian ambassadors retired covered with shame and confusion. That same evening, the sentence, to the great joy of all, was proclaimed that Joan was innocent and acquitted of all concern in the assassination of her husband. But as her conduct after the event and the indifference she had shown about pursuing the authors of the crime admitted no valid excuse, the Pope declared that there were plain traces of magic, and that the wrongdoing attributed to Joan was the result of some baneful charm cast upon her, which she could by no possible means resist. At the same time, His Holiness confirmed her marriage with Louis of Tarentum, and bestowed on him the Order of the Rose of Gold and the title of King of Sicily and Jerusalem. Joan, it is true, had on the eve of her acquittal sold the town of Avignon to the Pope for the sum of 80,000 florins. While the queen was pleading her case at the court of Clement VI, a dreadful epidemic, called the Black Plague, the same that Boccaccio has described so wonderfully, was ravaging the kingdom of Naples, and indeed the whole of Italy. According to the calculation of Matteo Villani, Florence lost 3/5 of her population, Bologna 2/3, and nearly all Europe was reduced in some frightful proportion. The Neapolitans were already weary of the cruelties and greed of the Hungarians. They were only awaiting some opportunity to revolt against the strangers' oppression, and to recall their lawful sovereign, whom, for all her ill deeds, they had never ceased to love. The attraction of youth and beauty was deeply felt by this pleasure-loving people. Scarcely had the pestilence thrown confusion into the army and town when loud cursing arose against the tyrant and his executioners. Louis of Hungary, suddenly threatened by the wrath of heaven and the people's vengeance, was terrified both by the plague and by the riots, and disappeared in the middle of the night. Leaving the government of Naples in the hands of Conrad Lupo, one of his captains, he embarked hastily at Barletta, and left the kingdom in very much the same way as Louis of Tarentum, fleeing from him, had left it a few months before. This news arrived at Avignon just when the pope was about to send the queen his bull of absolution. It was at once decided to take away the kingdom from Louis's viceroy. Nicolas Acciajuoli left for Naples with the marvellous bull that was to prove to all men the innocence of the queen, to banish all scruples and stir up a new enthusiasm. The councillor first went to the castle of Melzi, commanded by his son Lorenzo. This was the only fortress that had always held out. The father and son embraced with the honourable pride that near relatives may justly feel when they meet after they have united in the performance of a heroic duty. From the governor of Melzi, Louis of Tarentum's councillor learned that all men were wearied of the arrogance and vexatious conduct of the queen's enemies, and that a conspiracy was in train, started in the University of Naples, but with vast ramifications all over the kingdom, and moreover that there was dissension in the enemy's army. The indefatigable councillor went from Apulia to Naples, traversing towns and villages, collecting men everywhere, proclaiming loudly the acquittal of the queen and her marriage with Louis of Tarentum, also that the pope was offering indulgences to such as would receive with joy their lawful sovereigns. Then, seeing that the people shouted as he went by, "Long live Joan! Death to the Hungarians!" he returned and told his sovereigns in what frame of mind he had left their subjects. Joan borrowed money wherever she could, armed galleys, and left Marseille with her husband, her sister, and two faithful advisers, Acciajuoli and Spinelli, on the 10th of September 1348. The king and queen, not being able to enter at the harbour, which was in the enemy's power, disembarked at Santa Maria del Carmine, near the river Sabeto, amid the frenzied applause of an immense crowd, and accompanied by all the Neapolitan nobles. They made their way to the palace of Messere Agetorio, near Porta Capuana, the Hungarians having fortified themselves in all the castles, but Acciajuoli, at the head of the queen's partisans, blockaded the fortresses so ably that half of the enemy were obliged to surrender, and the other half took to flight and were scattered about the interior of the kingdom. We shall now follow Louis of Tarentum in his arduous adventures in Apulia, the Calabrias, and the Abruzzi, where he recovered one by one the fortresses that the Hungarians had taken. By dint of unexampled valour and patience, he at last mastered nearly all of the more considerable places, when suddenly everything changed, and fortune turned her back upon him for the second time. A German captain called Warner, who had deserted the Hungarian army to sell himself to the queen, had again played the traitor and sold himself once more, allowed himself to be surprised at Corneto by Conrad Lupo, the King of Hungary's vice-general, and openly joined him, taking along with him a great party of the adventurers who fought under his orders. This unexpected defection forced Louis of Tarentum to retire to Naples. The King of Hungary, soon learning that the troops had rallied round his banner, and only awaited his return to march upon the capital, disembarked with a strong reinforcement of cavalry at the port of Manfredonia, and taking Trani, Canossa, and Salerno, went forward to lay siege to Aversa. The news fell like a thunderclap on Joan and her husband. The Hungarian army consisted of 10,000 horse and more than 7,000 infantry, and Aversa had only 500 soldiers under Giacomo Pignatelli. In spite of the immense disproportion of the numbers, the Neapolitan general vigorously repelled the attack, and the King of Hungary, fighting in the front, was wounded in his foot by an arrow. Then Louis, seeing that it would be difficult to take the place by storm, determined to starve them out. For 3 months the besieged performed prodigies of valour, and further assistance was impossible. Their capitulation was expected at any moment, unless indeed they decided to perish every man. Renaud de Bao, who was to come from Marseille with a squadron of 10 ships to defend the ports of the capital and secure the queen's flight, should the Hungarian army get possession of Naples, had been delayed by adverse winds and obliged to stop on the way. All things seemed to conspire in favour of the enemy. Louis of Tarentum, whose generous soul refused to shed the blood of his brave men in an unequal and desperate struggle, nobly sacrificed himself and made an offer to the King of Hungary to settle their quarrel in single combat. We append the authentic letters that passed between Joan's husband and Andre's brother. Illustrious King of Hungary, who has come to invade our kingdom, we, by the grace of God, King of Jerusalem and Sicily, invite you to single combat. We know that you are in no wise disturbed by the death of your lancers or the other pagans in your suite, no more indeed than if they were dogs. But we, fearing harm to our own soldiers and men-at-arms, desire to fight with you personally, to put an end to the present war and restore peace to our kingdom. He who survives shall be king, and therefore, to ensure that this duel shall take place, we definitely propose as a site either Paris, in the presence of the King of France, or one of those towns of Perugia, Avignon, or Naples. Choose one of these 4 places and send us your reply." The King of Hungary first consulted with his council, and then replied, "Great King, we have read and considered your letter sent to us by the bearer of these presents, and by your invitation to a duel we are most supremely pleased. But we do not approve of any of the places you propose, since they are all suspect, and for several reasons. The King of France is your maternal grandfather, and although we are also connected by blood with him, the relationship is not so near. The town of Avignon, although nominally belonging to the sovereign pontiff, is the capital of Provence, and has always been subject to your rule. Neither have we any more confidence in Perugia, for that town is devoted to your cause. As to the city of Naples, there is no need to say that we refuse that rendezvous, since it is in revolt against us, and you are their king. But if you wish to fight with us, let it be in the presence of the Emperor of Germany, who is Lord Supreme, or the King of England, who is our common friend, or the Patriarch of Aquileia, a good Catholic. If you do not approve of any of the places we propose, we shall soon be near you with our army, and so remove all difficulties and delays. Then you can come forth, and our duel can take place in the presence of both armies." After the interchange of these 2 letters, Louis of Tarentum proposed nothing further. The garrison at Aversa had capitulated after a heroic resistance, and it was known only too well that if the King of Hungary could get so far as the walls of Naples, he would not have to endanger his life in order to seize that city. Happily, the Provençal galleys had reached port at last. The king and queen had only just time to embark and take refuge at Gaeta. The Hungarian army arrived at Naples. The town was on the point of yielding, and had sent messengers to the king humbly demanding peace. But the speeches of the Hungarians showed such insolence that the people, irritated past endurance, took up arms and resolved to defend their household goods with all the energy of despair. End of chapter 7. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.